That's my cue to start, I think. Good morning, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Sarah Ransom. I'm the General Manager of the Australian Water Partnership, and this is the first webinar of AWP's Water and Climate Dialogue series. Just to note, this webinar is being recorded and we will put it up on YouTube soon on the AWP channel so that people who miss the live webinar can catch up. Before we start, I'd like to hand over to Sonia Cooper. Miss Sonia Cooper is a Yorta Yorta woman raised by her nan on Kamaraganja. She has a strong interest in culture, the environment, science, policy law, contracts and geopolitics. She works as the Water and Climate Change Research Officer for Yorta Yorta and is a great advocate for the progression of cultural rights and cultural justice. Ms. Cooper has been engaged to sit on various boards around the country, including CSIRO's Indigenous Reference Group, and she's recently made a great contribution as the Indigenous co-author of Australia's State of the Environment Report Climate Chapter. Thanks, Sonia.
Thank you for that. So first of all, the Australian Water Partnerships acknowledge that all traditional custodians of the lands in which we are all streaming in from today. They recognise that there are traditional peoples who are calling in from Australia, the Solomon Islands, China, and whichever traditional group you belong to. The Australian Water Partnerships pay their respect and acknowledge your ancestors, your elders, and yourselves. They extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Please be mindful that we have Indigenous peoples with diverse backgrounds and knowledge sets, and that to use Indigenous peoples, traditional custodians, traditional owners, First Nations people, First Peoples, and so forth, does not water down your blood ties to country. The presenters will say these interchangeably, but recognise that each traditional group is distinct in how they refer to themselves, and we uphold this. I also respect this acknowledgement and pay my respects to my elders where I'm zooming in from today, Yorta Yorta country, and ask for safe passage in our exchange of knowledge today. Thank you.
Thanks, Sonia, for such a thoughtful and beautiful acknowledgement of country and of the diversity of cultures that join us today. I'm really proud today, actually, that the Australian Water Partnership is hosting this dialogue as part of our efforts to bring together water managers across Australia and the Indo-Pacific, including Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, to share stories of their water resource management and climate adaptation journeys. For those that aren't familiar with AWP, the Australian Water Partnership is a grant-based organisation aiming to match Australian water management expertise with international development needs to build a water for development community in our region and beyond. We are supported by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. AWP's vision to enhance sustainable water management in the Indo-Pacific and beyond has expanded explicitly to consider climate resilience. We know that more impacts of climate change are felt through water, in the form of storms and droughts and floods. Water is climate. Climate resilience encompasses the idea that everything we do to achieve water security needs to acknowledge and factor in the threat of climate change to people and to our systems. Of course, this is a complex challenge because climate change is experienced differently by people in different places. In AWP's recent work, this means that we are acting across our region on a range of activities, including assisting in Vietnam with efficiency of irrigation in drought-affected provinces. We're working to support valuing the contribution of nature-based solutions to urban flood management in Thailand and in Vietnam. And we're also assisting with surface water hydrology support to improve early warning systems for flash floods in the Pacific. And we do all this work with close appreciation of the way that gender, disability, and social inclusion factors interact with water systems. This is a very important idea when we think about water security and adaptation to climate change. Water security means having water of the right quality, quantity, at the right time and place in a reliable manner. But what this means on the ground depends on who you are and where you are. Local, community and Indigenous knowledge is therefore central to water security and climate adaptation. With this series of dialogues, AWP aims to explore what this looks like in practice. We aim to share and tell stories that contribute to the store of knowledge on the interface between the huge challenge of water security and climate change and the role of Indigenous, local and traditional knowledge. Thank you all for attending and playing a role in highlighting the endeavours and achievements of our partners in Australia and across the region in the climate action space. AWP will be echoing and amplifying these contributions in our work across the next year or two, particularly in engaging with UN processes, where there is a great thirst for action-oriented and practical case studies. Okay, just some housekeeping before we continue. So obviously we're recording the webinar and we'll put it up on YouTube for later. We are going to use a platform called Slido that you might have come across if you've been with us on events before. So we're going to use Slido for Q&A and also to do a little bit of audience interaction. So on the screen there, you can see a QR code. You can scan that with your smartphone camera, or you can also on your desktop go to slido.com and enter hashtag water_climate. And I think there'll be a link pasted in the chat as well. In Slido, you'll be able to ask questions throughout the session. So I really encourage you to just please be as lively and interactive as you want. You can add your name, or the default is actually to remain anonymous, and there's no login required. But if you are asking a question, please add who it's directed at. For those watching later, please email comments and questions to our contact@waterpartnership.org.au address, and we will answer your questions when we publish our FAQ document. Okay, so that's Slido. We'll just move on to the agenda now. We have a pretty packed agenda for today, and we look forward to hearing from you throughout the session. So we'll start with a scene-setting presentation on the links between water and climate change. Then we're going to move on to some case studies, and we're really pleased to have some amazing speakers today from the Pacific, Asia and Australia that will demonstrate how partnerships have added value to contribute to and enable water security under the pressure of climate change. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A, so again, please put your questions and comments in at any point. Finally, I'd just like to say thanks to the speakers for sharing your experiences with us. We know that this is knowledge that's very close to your hearts, so again, thank you for your generosity in doing that. And thank you to the University of Southern Queensland team for your support in organising this webinar and series. Okay, we thought we might just kick off with a little interactive exercise. We received quite a lot of interest in this webinar, and so we thought it might be nice to ask everybody where you're joining us today. So just check into Slido and use Slido there to tell us the location that you're at. And check in from and acknowledge your own location, as we're all trying to do today, think about the places where we are physically. We've got Hobart, a lot of people in Canberra, not a surprise. Hello, Melbourne, Renmark, Bundaberg, Canberra, Ngunnawal country. Fantastic, lots of participants from Australia. Melbourne, New South Wales, a couple of people from Brisbane, hello there. Bellingen, lovely spot, and Bundaberg as well. Australia. Bangkok. I'm also in Bangkok today. Hello, fellow Bangkok-based person. Fantastic. Oh, rainy Melbourne. That's a surprise. Not really a surprise. Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, Renmark, and Darwin. Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. It's good to say hello, good to check in. So we might move on now to bring in our speakers. So today we have representatives from the Yorta Yorta and Kamilaroi Nations, China, the Solomon Islands and Australia. So we'll go to our Australian speaker first, which is Scott Power, who's the director of the Centre for Applied Climate Sciences at University of Southern Queensland. He's an adjunct professor in the School of Earth, Atmosphere and Environment and Monash, manager of Climate Services International, and associate investigator in the ARC Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes, and an all-round climate expert for the DFAT-funded Australia-Pacific Climate Partnership. Scott was previously a senior principal research scientist in the Bureau of Meteorology and a coordinating lead author of the Ipcc Working Group 1 report and an author of the Ipcc synthesis report that informed the Paris Agreement. He's published extensively in the international literature on climate science. Thanks, Scott. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Good morning, everybody. Yes, today, as Sarah mentioned, I'd like to touch on some of the links between climate and water resource management. Next slide, please, Lucia. And thanks, Sonia, for the acknowledgement. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we gather, and we'd also like to pay our respects to our elders past, present and emerging. Next slide, please. And I'd like to cover 6 main topics. First, to reflect on the importance of climate variability, on the impact of climate variability on water resources, and then give an extremely brief introduction to the science of climate change. And then I'd like to describe projections relevant to water resource management and also some of the impacts of climate change on water resources. And then I'll touch on the need for, in order to manage climate change, the need for mitigation and adaptation, and I'll clarify what I mean by those terms shortly. Then I'll also point out that water resource management is not only needed for adaptation, adapting to climate change, but also to reduce net emissions or mitigation. And then I'll provide a short summary and a key take-home message for all the water resource managers online. And the main sources of information I'll use for this presentation are 2 recent IPCC reports. IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The first one was about physical climate science, and the second one is all about impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. Next slide, thanks. And I'd also like to acknowledge the input, very helpful input I've received from Sarah, Lucia, Catherine at the AWP, and also Mandy and some of my other colleagues at the University of Southern Queensland. Thanks. So let's start by looking at the impact of climate variability on water. And out of the millions of examples I could have given, I've just chosen this one, which shows a time series of annual rainfall in Australia from 1900 through to 2020. And so each of these skinny vertical bars represents the total amount of rainfall received across the country, or the average amount of rainfall per area received across the country. And you can see there's an enormous amount of variability from year to year, even decade to decade and generation to generation. So you can see in 2019, for example, we received the lowest on record since 1900, but there is another period in 1974, which was a La Nina year, where we received over 700 millimetres. So the lowest was below 300 millimetres, the highest is above, during this period, was above 700 millimetres. So you can see that's an enormous range of variability. And I could have chosen a time series if it was available for all of the locations that we've just seen from all of the participants and beyond, in Australia, the Pacific, and in Asia as well. And the story is the same. There's a huge amount of variability on not just water, but other water-related issues, water-related factors. But of course, in addition to a huge amount of natural variability, we now have to face and manage a changing climate. And we know that the science is very clear that increases in greenhouse gas concentrations arising from human activity has resulted in the warming of the planet, especially over the last 60 years or so. And we also note that the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere now are higher than they've been for at least 800,000 years. So it's not surprising that we're starting to see some fairly major changes already. And in fact, the IPCC report concludes that the Earth's water cycle has already changed in response to human activities. So let's now turn to some of the projections relevant to water resource management from the IPCC report. And the first one I'd like to show are projected changes in surface air temperature for 3 different scenarios. One is if the world was to warm up by 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to the latter half of the 19th century, 2 degrees global warming and 4 degrees global warming. And of course, we don't know which one is going to be what the world will actually look like in the future, because we don't know whether or not the world will be successful in adhering to the Paris Agreement. If the agreement is, sorry, just go back to that slide, please. Thank you very much. Is successful, there will be down towards the 1.5 degrees Celsius map. whereas if it's very unsuccessful, we'll be up near the 4 degrees map. Next slide, please. And it's important to note that it's not just temperature that's going to change. There'll be lots of other climatic factors. And it points out that without large-scale reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, global warming is projected to cause further substantial changes in the water cycle at both global and regional scales. Next slide, please. And of course, as I mentioned, things other than temperature are going to change. And you can also look at, as the Ipcc report does, projected changes in long-term average annual precipitation. So before we saw annual precipitation from year to year for Australia, this shows the long-term average of precipitation right across the world from climate models, again for 3 different possibilities: 1.5 degrees global warming, 2 degrees global warming in the middle, and 4 degrees global warming towards the end. And so we see that unlike temperature changes, which are positive everywhere, you see that in some places precipitation decreases, whereas in other places precipitation increases. So it tends to increase in the equatorial regions, especially in the Pacific, and over high latitudes. It tends to increase across Africa, Central and North Africa, across the subcontinent into Asia, and it tends to decrease in the southwestern parts of the southern continents, as well as the Caribbean and across the Atlantic into the Mediterranean. Next slide, please. And it's important to note that while projected changes in long-term average precipitation can be positive, it goes up in one place and go down in another place, variability tends to increase in many places. So we find that continued global warming is projected to further intensify the global warming water cycle, including its variability. And by the way, many of you are familiar with the impact that ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation, has on climate in our region. And the rainfall variability associated with it is also projected to increase as the century unfolds. And by the way, intense rainfall is also expected to increase in frequency and intensity, but not at nearly all locations over land. So again, long-term average rainfall can go up or down depending on where you are, whereas the intense rainfall, the wettest day of the year or the wettest day of the decade, that kind of thing, that's projected to increase in both frequency and intensity at nearly all locations over land. Thanks. So let's now look at some of the impacts associated with these projected changes on water resources. The first one I'd like to talk about is drought. And the Ipcc report concludes that while the effect of climate change on drought varies across regions, increases in the frequency and intensity of both agricultural and ecological droughts in some regions are projected. Next slide, please. And when it comes to flood, the report concludes that a warmer climate increases the amount and intensity of rainfall during wet events, as we just saw, and this is expected to amplify the severity of flooding. However, the link between rainfall and flooding is complex. So while the most severe flooding events are expected to worsen, floods may become less frequent in some regions. For example, in some of those regions where there's a very marked decline in long-term average rainfall. Next slide, please. And one key inference we can draw from a lot of this information is that the past, in many contexts, may no longer be a good guide to the future. So we really do need to plan for events that go beyond historical experience. Next slide, please. And some of the other impacts, well, the first one we just talked about, drought. The second one is severe recent heavy rainfall events that we've witnessed in Australia and elsewhere, by the way, led to substantial flooding, were made more likely by anthropogenic climate change. So we've seen extreme rainfall events before, but they're more likely now because of anthropogenic climate change. And the report also concludes that at 4 degrees Celsius global warming, by the end of the century, approximately 10% of the global land area is projected to face simultaneously increasing high extreme stream flow and decreasing low extreme flow. So in other words, the range or the envelope of possibilities is going to expand, and that will affect over 2.1 billion people. And finally, the increase in extreme events is projected to compromise the efficacy of water sanitation and hygiene services and slow progress towards reductions in wash-related disease burdens. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, so far, we've focused primarily on impacts that arise through changes in the water cycle. But it's important to realise that water resource management will also be affected indirectly through things like sea level rise. So we know that sea level rise coupled with storm surges and waves will exacerbate coastal inundation and the potential for increased saltwater intrusion into aquifers. Thank you. Next slide. And so in order to manage climate change, we can do two things. We can adapt or revise arrangements to adapt to changes that have already occurred or changes that are projected. The other important thing we can do is to try and reduce net greenhouse gas emissions. So the first part is called adaptation. The second one is mitigation. To be more precise, just to be clear, in human systems, adaptation is defined as the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects in order to moderate harm or take advantage of beneficial opportunities. So, for example, a simple adaptation strategy might be to add a veranda to the west side of your house to reduce afternoon heating. Next slide, please. And mitigation is a term that's used in different senses in different communities, different technical communities. In climate science, it's restricted to precisely mean actions or activities that limit emissions of greenhouse gases from entering the atmosphere and or reduce their levels in the atmosphere. So some examples of mitigation would be reducing fossil fuel use, so that would reduce emissions. But on the other hand, you might remove carbon from the atmosphere by, for example, reforestation. And another simple example of mitigation would be to replace a diesel generator with a solar-powered generator. Next slide, please. And I wanted to point out that in climate change adaptation that's currently, well, it's already happening around the world, water resource management, water-related hazards, managing water-related hazards has been fundamentally important to the progress in many instances. In fact, most of the adaptation interventions to date are forged in response to water-related hazards. So water resource managers and people that manage water-related issues are front and centre to the world's climate change effort. Why might that be the case? Well, we know that roughly half of the world's 8 billion people are estimated to experience severe water scarcity for at least some part of the year due to climatic and non-climatic factors. And since the 1970s, 44% of all disaster events have been flood related. So water resource managers shouldn't think they're at the periphery when it comes to climate change. They're actually in the spotlight. Next slide, please. And by the way, just one final point is that the role of water resource managers isn't just in adaptation. They can also play an important part in some kinds of mitigation. So, for example, we know that because many mitigation measures, such as carbon capture and storage, bioenergy and afforestation, and reforestation, can have a high water footprint. And so, when planning mitigation, one should also consider the implications it might have for water resource management. And by the way, when we're adapting, we should also consider what emissions may be caused as a result. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next talk. So in summary, there are very many important links between water resource management and climate. We saw that climate variability is in many situations and contexts needs to be addressed and is widely addressed currently. But we also saw that climate change affects many water-related hazards and that it has impacts directly relevant to water resource management. And one of the points I made near the end was that water resource management is fundamentally important to many adaptation strategies, and that water resource management can be a crucial consideration or incorporation when it comes to some mitigation strategy, e.g. reforestation. The last slide I wanted to show is this one here, which is the take-home message, and that is that water resource managers are on the front line for both adaptation and in some cases mitigation. So we really do need you. And who's we? It's the future generations, it's the health of the planet and its ecosystems and its communities, and including those who are most vulnerable to some of these impacts. And you're also needed to help underpin economic security. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott, for setting the scene with that very insightful and a little bit scary presentation, and also for the reminder that as people working in water, it's not just adaptation but mitigation that we can make a contribution towards. Just a reminder to participants that you can put some questions or comments in Slido at any stage using the QR code that I showed before, or the link on the chat. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker now. We're absolutely delighted to have Mr. Lloyd Tahani with us, who will present the first case study of the session. As Deputy Director of Meteorology, Mr. Tahani assists with oversight of operations of the Solomon Islands Meteorological Service. He has worked in the Department of Ministry of Environment, Climate Change, Disaster Management and Meteorology for the last 30 years. He's developed a strong sense of commitment to the development of meteorology and climate services in the Solomon Islands, his home country, and this experience gave him a deeper appreciation on how multi-hazard early warning systems can reach the last mile in the Solomon Islands. Thank you, Lloyd. We're really excited to be hearing from you.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning or good afternoon to all of you. Next slide. I'll be talking about early warning system in Solomon Islands, and it will be a very a brief presentation. Next slide. So by putting the scene, setting on the scene of this presentation about early warning system, I guess within the United Nations framework, it talks about an integrated system of hazard monitoring, forecasting and prediction, disaster risk assessment, communication and preparedness activities, and so forth. And that also enables individual communities, government, business, and others next. And also to take timely actions to reduce the disaster risk in advance of hazardous events. So according to the UNISDR, an effective early warning system is end-to-end, people-centered, and consider the nature of multiple hazards occurring simultaneously, cascading or culminating over time. Next slide. We put this approach on this early warning system at community level, and this is become very important because important that the vulnerable communities are resilient. Also important that to know that they also communities also have existing early warning systems they use using traditional knowledge. Innovative ways to simplify the complex meteorological information for use by the communities. That is a very important approach. Working with communities to identify solutions that would for them. And this means inclusive, appropriate and sustainable community early warning system. And importantly, to work within the government structure, the National Disaster Management Office implementation framework. And also with this approach, important to recognize the value that partners networking is very important with NGOs, civil society and non-traditional partners to reach communities in the last mile. So there's this project that started way back in 2018 through partnership between AHP, BOM, World Vision Solomon Islands and Solomon Islands Meteorological Service, and it aims to strengthen the local humanitarian capacity and preparedness in Solomon Islands, mainly in Makira or Santa Cristobal Islands in Solomon Islands. So important that the focus is to have the communities better able to respond to and recover from rapid and slow onset disasters. And it focuses much more on disaster risk reduction and preparedness at the community level. So the outcome that this project is looking to achieve is that in the outcome one, communities are better prepared for the slow onset and rapid disasters. Outcome two is that the right and needs of women, people with disabilities, youth and children are being met in disaster preparedness and response at all levels. And outcome three, the government with the NGOs and the private sectors, including the communities, coordinate more effectively for the inclusive disaster preparedness and response. Next slide. And so why TK? Why talking about traditional knowledge? Traditional knowledge on weather and climate is essential ancestral knowledge passed down through different generations, and it enables people to read variation in the environment, such as the behaviors of plants, animal, meteorological or astronomical changes to predict approaching weather or seasonal changes. Next. And we call these changes in the natural environment indicators because they indicate that a change in the weather or climate will occur. Next. So the aim of the traditional knowledge project is to document, monitor, and integrate traditional methods of weather forecasting into forecast products. So that is why it is important to have this traditional knowledge. So traditional knowledge and early warning system at community level has been around in Solomon Islands, and it has shown during the COSPACT traditional knowledge project that while Solomon Islands produce weather, climate, and ocean forecast, there is little uptake and use of this information by the community. Next. So community members usually ignore advices from Solomon Islands Meteorological Service due to lack of understanding on technical nature of the information that are provided to them through radio, and they tend to rely more on readily available traditional knowledge on weather and climate as it interactions with the environment around them, which they are familiar with. So the concept of end-to-end or service to the last mile promoted by the UNIS DRA, the last mile being the communities which the most vulnerable. So in the project, there are 4 communities identified at this at Makira province, and as you see on the slide, that's the island of Makira in Solomon Islands, and you have these 4 communities on the northern side of the island. You have Tadadi. Next slide, please. Tadadi Community, and Tadadi Community is a community that has 177 population. It's located around hillside, and their main income is agricultural products, also subsistence farming. They also walk 30 minutes to the nearest school to get education. Next, please. The second community is Wango community, and it is very interesting to know that Wango has been a bit populated. Its population is 380, and it located along the coast. It has a clinic and a school that is about half a kilometers on the hill from the village. The source of income also comes from agricultural products. The next slide, please. The next community is Matawaniauhi. Matawaniauhi has a 467 population. It also located near coast, and it has a clinic, school in the community. The communities are located between 2 huge rivers, hence expose this community vulnerable to flooding. Next, please. So the 4th community is Manihuki, and Manihuki has 86 population. This community located 7 kilometers from the provincial capital of Makira province, which is called Kirikira. The school, there is a school, but have to travel to Kirikira to get medical assistance. So the community also located very near to coastal seaside, also vulnerable to the rising sea level, tides, and also sea surge during extreme weather events. Next, please. And so, with this traditional knowledge exercise, there is 5 stages in which we engage in. The stage 1 is doing a survey and also recording on what the communities have. And then after receiving this data, we archive them, or in other words, we put them into a traditional knowledge database. And while having this data within the traditional database, we also are performing monitoring on this data, ensure that they are reliable, they do happen as it has been said by the community members. And once it is verified, and then we do analysis and also integration of this information, and we integrate or incorporate this within our forecasting system, and then communicate or disseminate the information back to the community. So the process in which we did in getting the primary data, we used the 3 research technique that was used to obtain primary data, and that is snowballing and also face-to-face, and also field observation. Next. So out of the survey that was done through these communities, a perception of this community on reliability of traditional knowledge indicator, you have 22%, they said it always correct, and then 36% they said sometimes right, sometimes wrong, and then 42% they say more right than wrong, using the traditional indicators in early warning system. Next. And also what these communities use for forecasting. Out of the survey, we have this community Tadadi. They also have they use both TK and also Met Services information, and they only about 15% that use TK for forecasting. Wango also have both TK and Met Services, about 20% rather, and then only traditional knowledge about 7%. And the Manita, they don't use traditional knowledge, they only use more Met Services and TK altogether, and Manihuki and so forth. Next, please. So the community's perception or perceptives on combining the weather and seasonal forecast with traditional indicators provide this outcome. You have about above 20%. They said, I would like someone to provide this information for myself and the community and the other, and so forth. So as you see on the screen, people's perspectives on combining weather and seasonal forecast with TK indicators as they express as shown on the graph. Next, please. So after having these 4 communities, this traditional knowledge and early warning system extended to additional 4 communities, and these additional 4 communities are Maniora community, Waita, Karauna, and also Togori. Next, please. And out of the surveys that has been done with these additional communities, you have 54%. They said more right than wrong, using the reliability of the indicators, TK, and also 33%. They said that reliability of TK indicators are always right, and then 13% sometimes right, sometimes wrong. Next, please. And so forth, what sites use to use the forecast weather. It also shown there both TK and Met forecasters that these new communities also use. Next, please. And so these communities, in terms of combining traditional knowledge and modern forecast, 67% they would like someone to provide this information to themselves and also to their communities. 33% also would like improve community awareness of weather and climate events. Next, please. And so, translating the climate information for the communities, we work with communities through workshops and also training. The Early Action Rainfall Year Watch Bulletin that they requested to be translated to Pidgin version, and that is one of the examples that you've seen on the screen that is being done and provided to the communities. Next, please. The other is regarding the tropical cyclone tracking map training that has been done in Makira, as you've seen there. This is translate understanding on the tropical cyclone, understanding their location and also what impacts it would done to the communities. And the training has been a very successful training. Next. Not only with the tropical cyclone, but with the marine, a flag-based early warning system was installed at Tulagi, Central Province. As you see with the two flags, one with red that it's a warning, blue meaning it's a fine day. So the small boat operators that travel across the islands, they can only see types of flags telling them that that is the condition, the current condition for the winds and also the ocean. Next, please. Apart from all these early warning activities, there are awareness that is also provided. So the information that has been provided, these posters were used during the WMO Day in 2020 and is funded by BOM, and also the transcribe and translate climate crab animation from English to Pidgin, and we also incorporated sign language for the Solomon Islands Deaf Association to understand the ENSO variability. And also there is an installation of floodgates in Wango community, that community that sit between the two huge rivers, to help them monitor the flood. Next, please. So the significant achievements that I would like to highlight on outcome one. One is development of traditional knowledge seasonal calendars. This community has these calendars to support them with the early warning system, and then not only that, but establish the capacity building of that village disaster committees and their management plan, and also training in communities to improve understanding of severe weather and so forth. The others, the outcome two, next please. We engage with disabilities, women groups, and identify the specific needs in early warning system messages. On the outcome three of the project, next please. With the government, NGO, and the private sector, which is, it means partnership between Australia, Bureau of Meteorology, Solomon Islands, and also World Vision, that strengthened the advancement of the early warning system in Solomon Islands. Next, please. The challenges is, whilst we engage in this exercise, we need a TK lead in Solomon Islands. We would like to thank the project to support us with a project officer, but then that project officer now left. We have to see where we can get others to come in and take lead on this. Of course, the major challenge is financial support to advance the activity of the traditional knowledge, resources that is required. But one thing that we also see in this process is that natural hazards also affect monitoring sites, and then of course the COVID-19. Next, please. The opportunities, we see support from the ASP, COSPAC, BOMS, PrEP, etc. There are regional partners that can support us in this engagement. Much more to be done, especially in communication area. As a traditional project methodologies are being fed into other programs, projects and policies, and then the traditional project forming strong linkage and data sharing. Next, please. Interdisciplinary nature of the project. Well, as we see, Solomon Island Meteorological Service does not have the capacity to reach the community with early warning messages. The World Vision Solomon Islands have the experience in working with communities, and through the project collaboration, the specific weather and climate needs of women groups, disabled groups and communities are identified, and with this interdisciplinary nature of the project, it enhances the early warning system in Solomon Islands with partnership networking. Next, please. And so, by way of wrapping, would like to acknowledge AHP, Australian Government, Bureau of Meteorology, Dr. Scott and team, and also the World Vision Solomon Islands for this initiative. Assist Solomon Islands build its early warning system capacity to reach the last mile in Solomon Islands, and also provide support towards traditional knowledge in Solomon Islands. And of course, BOM team for the funding support and facilitation. And thank you for your attention. I hope I do not really extend over the time that is been appropriate to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd. So interesting. We didn't want to wrap you up before you were finished. So thanks very much for sharing your experience of implementing early warning systems in the Solomon Islands. What a great example of how science of early warning systems is blending with the human capital of communities that might be impacted by disasters, including all members of the community. And I found it really interesting that you described the integration where all sources of knowledge can reinforce each other. And I really like the idea of a climate crab too. I think that's really cool. So we'll move on to our next speaker, which is Jianbing Wang. He's going to present our second case study. Jianbing is from the Water Sensitive Cities Australia at Monash University. By collaborating with researchers and practitioners from multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral backgrounds, Jianbing translates research into practice and provides transformative responses to emerging urban challenges. He promotes multifunctional infrastructure and applies circular economy approaches to deliver water-sensitive city visions at a range of spatial scales using urban design, landscape architecture, and industrial design as integrative platforms. Jianbing has worked extensively with governments, industry, and research organisations, and has implemented over 30 on-the-ground demonstration projects across Australia, China, Singapore, and Israel. Thank you, Jianbing. We're delighted you're here with us.
So thank you very much, Sarah, for the kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. Greetings from Melbourne. I think the central message I'm trying to convey today is that if we want to build urban resilience against climate change, we probably need to, think about a system that can cope with multiple scenarios. And one of the ways to achieve that is to build a multifunctional hybrid infrastructures so that we can deal with the multiple challenges and deliver multiple benefits to the community. So why I make that point is because climate change doesn't mean the old problem will just simply go away. We still have to deal with challenges such as water pollution, drought, floods, river degradation, and the heat, because they all somehow relate to how we manage water in the cities. So ideally, they should be all tackled in the coordinated and integrated way so that we don't unintentionally shift between the problems. And with the introduction of climate change, things are going to exacerbate, as pointed out by Scott. But we're also going to get compounding events. For example, we're going to have a coastal flooding coupled with sea level rise. An extended drought could be coupled with urban heat waves. And more importantly, we're also going to have uncertainty because both droughts and floods could occur in the same city and sometimes occur in the same year. So how do we deal with all these challenges that is overlaid with a high level of uncertainty And we think the way forward is a multifunctional hybrid infrastructure. So let me give an example. What do we mean by that? And this is a Clear Paddy Creek in New South Wales, one of the earliest ecological restoration projects in Australia. You can see before restoration, it's just a canalized channel that most of the time is useless unless there's rain. But once you restore it into a more natural form by reestablishing the riparian and in-stream vegetation, keep water there, we start to bring ecology back to the community. And more importantly, it dramatically improved the amenity to the people living around it. And we'll also be able to keep the level of flood conveyance to the same. So you see suddenly the project now start to deliver multiple benefits to the community, and those benefits are all year round. So this represents a very significant shift in thinking that from a traditional, a single purpose engineering piece that is largely driven by economy of scale to now a multifunctional piece that is driven by economy of scopes, multifunctional and multiple benefits. Next, please. So the question is, does multifunctional infrastructure needs to be this big? The answer is no. We can make it as simple as and small as an urban tree. This is a tree pit in Dockland Street, Melbourne. You can see instead of having planted on a raised platform, it is actually sunken lower than the road surfaces with openings on the curb, such that every time it rains, the water runs off the road surfaces. It gets into the tree pit, attenuated, water slowly percolate downwards through the root zone and then get picked up by the stormwater pipe. And in doing so, because the trees are passively irrigated, we're going to have a better and healthier root system, which leads to a much larger and healthier canopy. If you line up the whole street with such a tree pit, we're going to have dramatically improved amenity values for the neighborhood. And it's also going to help to improve the microclimate and mitigate urban heat waves. Next, please. So the idea is really not looking for additional space to host this system, but they should be all embedded into the every corner of urban fabric. And they should just be part of the landscape. And to date, we have done enough proof of concept on the ground to show this could be done at every scale across the city, from the buildings to streetscape to precinct, all the way to city scale. Next, please. So in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to walk you through two case studies in Asia, one in China, one in Thailand, to illustrate how the notion of a multifunctional infrastructure helped them to manage their water problem. The first one is in the city of Kunshan. It's just out of Shanghai and part of the Yangtze Delta. And the city of Kunshan has 6,000 years of history. Right? This is where the oldest irrigated rice paddy was discovered in China. And since then, the city progressively established a huge network of waterways and polders in response to the agricultural need, as well as the flood protection need in the Delta environment. So the challenge the city facing today is water pollution, as well as flood protection due to the industrialization and urbanization of the Delta. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the challenge for us is that how do we develop or formulate a water strategy that respects the traditional knowledge and the agricultural heritage of the city, but also build on from the wisdom of the polder and canals for flood irrigation that developed by Asian Chinese. So this is what we have done. We want to make the canals multifunctional. Basically, it can be both used for flood attenuation as well as stormwater harvesting. So for example, water is treated by rain gardens spouts before it reaches the canal. Water is recirculated through the wetland to make it, to clean it and improve water quality. Then the water can be reused for non-potable consumptions. And more importantly, because of that reuse, we actually create more room to attenuate the floods when the next time rain comes. So we call this a polder strategy. Next one, please. So this is one example at a city scale to illustrate how do we operationalize that strategy. And this is a multifunctional corridor that we help the city develop along a 40-kilometer long elevated ring road that framing the core part of the city. And we'll call this a gray, green, and blue. As you can see, where gray is for traffic for cars, and green for ecology, landscape, water treatment, and blue for waterways and canals. And how this works is every time it rains, the water runs off the road surface and gets discharged into the wet end in the green corridor first, get attenuated and treated before the clean water goes out to the blue corridor. And during extreme floods, the water level in the blue corridor in the canals will start to rise, and they start to occupy part of the green corridor so that we can increase the flood attenuation and flood conveyance capacity. So today we have done over 30 projects on the ground to show how do we operationalize each of the elements in that proposal strategy that we have been developed. Next one, please. So this is a project in Thailand in the regional city called City of Ryan, part of the Eastern Economic Corridors. And the city is facing, lack of drainage, combined sewer flows. As you can see from the photos on the right, they have hanging pipes channeling roof runoff and then pouring it down to the street. So every time it rains, the building becomes a waterfall. And more importantly, they also have a huge urban heat issues. As you can see from the photos on the left, the public space between the buildings is just large concrete, right? Virtually there's no vegetation at all. So in managing this water, we really want to learn from the traditional Thai people how they manage heat in the day-to-day life. All the way from buildings have well ventilated roofs and building on stumps, and they take advantage of the tree canopies, the shadings, also living by the river lifestyle, trying to take advantage of the evaporative cooling. So we learn all of that and start to develop this. So instead of just looking at the buildings and the street individually and separately, we actually want to look at the whole space as entirety. So instead of building, help them build large pipes that bury at the ground and connect to the stump pipe, we actually want to build a planter boxes for them. So the planter box can connect with the hanging pipes, so that the planter box is used to harvest rainfall from the roof, and then treat it, attenuate it, and reuse that water back to the vegetation by climbing up to the building facade. So the previous slide, please. And in terms of the street runoff, it actually goes through the tree pit, very similar to the system that I described in Melbourne. But that starts to give more canopies, more greeneries to this space, and we call this a green canyon strategies, because both the planter box and tree pit can be integrated with urban furniture, seatings, tables, and they can be part of the commercial offerings at ground level. Next one, please. Thank you. So if they implement this green canyon strategy, it could be something like this, right? We not only help them to manage the water issues, but also help to improve the quality of the space and bring ecology back to the cities. So and then when the air breeze funnels through this canyon, it is actually conditioned by the evapotranspiration provided by those plants. And then the plants are supported passively by the stormwater and rainwater. So in summary, that we really like to promote the idea of using multifunctional infrastructure to build urban resilience and encourage people to shift their mindset from an economy of scale to now economy of scope, so that we can deliver multiple benefits. With that, thank you very much. Hopefully I didn't take too much time. Thank you, Sarah.
You, Jedvin. Thank you. Thanks for your presentation demonstrating the multiple benefits that nature-based solutions can have to adapt and mitigate climate change. There's two great examples there with Kunchang and Rayong of integrating traditional knowledge. So thank you for your contribution. So now I'll hand over to Jason Wilson for the last case study of today. Jason is part of the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holders Office and the Narran Lakes Joint Management Committee. Jason is an Aboriginal man or Murri of the Kennedy Morgan and Peters families. His grandfather's country language is Gamilaroi from the Barwon River in northwest New South Wales, and his grandmother's country language is Yuwalaroy, in the Narran River in northwest New South Wales, in the northern Murray-Darling Basin in Australia. Jason's aim is to incorporate Aboriginal values into water initiatives within the Commonwealth and New South Wales governments. He currently works for the Commonwealth Environmental Water Office as a local engagement officer and chairs the Narran Lakes Joint Management Committee tackling climate change adaptation. Jason, we can't wait to hear from you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Sonia, for the wonderful welcome. I'm in Canberra at the moment, so I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and also pay respects to my elders, both past and present, and my ancestral lands. Where I come from, the Narran, which you'll see in that slide there, that's Burragumman, we call it back home, and Burragumman means big water. That lake, for scale, is about 20 kilometres wide, and we've been doing some wonderful work on the ground out there with the national park, and I just want to acknowledge some of the statements on climate change from the National Aboriginal Gathering, the Cultural Dialogue on Climate Change with CSIRO. That was a wonderful conference a year or two ago, and also the wonderful work that the Yorta Yorta have put into the Utica Declaration, where a cultural flow and water entitlements that are legally and beneficially owned by Indigenous nations and are sufficiently and adequately quality and quantity to improve the spiritual, cultural, environmental, social and economic conditions of those Indigenous nations. This is our inherent right. So about 42 nations right across the Murray-Darling Basin have adopted that particular piece of work, and I just want to acknowledge the wonderful work that they've done. I also want to acknowledge in this slide the case study that we have started up there in my country, in Narran, is the wonderful pathways methodology that we've embarked upon with the New South Wales government, with their climate change adaptation group, and Polly and her team, Mal Ridges and his team, certainly the National Parks and Wildlife Service, the Joint Management Committee of the Narran Lakes Nature Reserve, and those members. We're a motley crew, and we really appreciate the support, not only from the federal and state governments through CHUO, the Commonwealth Environmental Water Office, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, and the CSIRO, but also some of those universities like the University of New England, and the pathway methodology that we're adopting. I think it's, don't quote me on this, is the New South Wales University, and we'll go into some of that a little bit later, but I just wanted to certainly put that to the forefront. That's country right there, and there's a picture of our wonderful dreaming story there. When we bring people out to country, we take them through that drawing that depicts our country on a picture board there, which we call the education node, and we make sure that they become connected to country through that story and understand the creation of why water is in our landscape. And I think it's wonderful that we could merge both those pictures together and put them on our picture board on our education node. So climate change is a real doozy, like our highway, we've suffered in the last 10 years, probably 8 years of drought, and it's only in the last couple of years that we've seen the abundance of water come back. So we're going through less rainfall patterns now, and longer and more severe droughts. So we're talking about towns like Walgett, Brewarrina and Burke in the northern part of the state, their days of month of over 44 degrees, which is quite extreme and severe. More extreme heat waves in the summer, and that also comes back to our open days that we have out at Narran with our elders. We don't want to make sure that they're cold. We don't want them to feel sick when they go to country, even though you do feel a little bit sad when there is no water there in the system. So we're really working hard to try and get these parameters around predicting what climate change looks like at Narran. Less flooding and frequently smaller. So it's exacerbated the damage to country from wind-blown seed bank destruction, and certainly when those floods come, because there's no grasslands or rangelands to protect the soil slumping and a whole suite of other things are occurring. So the intergenerational cultural genocide, I think that's why we embarked upon this particular project. And it was important that we picked a particular icon or a indicator species. So we decided to go with the lignum bush. Lignum is one of those cultural indicators that certainly need water, and it's a floodplain specialist. But these beautiful birds that you see sitting on the lake when they have water, they nest on them, and they're called straw-necked divers. And at Narran, it's one of those very, very key places to breed. So they come there in hundreds of thousands to breed on the top of these beautiful lignum expanses. So we call them murugu, the birds. But you can see down in the left-hand corner, down the bottom, that's our joint management committee going to town on a bit of information around not only the lignum, but more so how we start to populate information about our cultural practice, and certainly the way that we want lignum to be explained. So you can see there the cultural pathways methodology. It looks like up in the right-hand corner, looks like a bit of a what is it, a stubway or but it gives you those high extremes and negotiable and low attributes, but also our monitoring and our evaluation on the left-hand column, and when we can access and do things. So we really want to start doing some planning around it. We're in the very early instigation of what we want to implement out there. Like COVID has really knocked us around, as in we couldn't continue to plan and do a lot of that work. And I hope that now that COVID has gone, it's still here, but it's sort of slowed down a fair bit, we might be able to get on with getting our planning right. So that little beautiful girl is the reason why we're planning our hearts out on country up there. We want to make sure that she has a future and her families to come have a future. So the adaptation pathways will help us do that. And when we need to do it, to control established ideals, and we've got a whole suite of things that we're doing, not only with national parks and wildlife, but in amongst ourselves. We're looking at a utilized strategic plan, education package, open day celebrations. We're also populating our information now into the operational plan and the plan of management for the Narran Lakes, and we're just embarking with the science division within national parks, a monitoring, evaluation and reporting process. So that'll underpin the understanding of water and early intervention from our planning earlier on. The future for our culture. So this young man, he started going out there when he was 7 years old, and that's him in year 7, and now he's in year 12. I think he's year 11, and his older sister's the captain of the school at Lightning Ridge. And it was wonderful to take that picture of him way back in the day. He's a very good dancer now, and he loves dancing on country. And that's a part of the way that we celebrate our strong cultural connections here. And we've put recently just put a stone arrangement in, so when you come out to Narran, and you can see Narran in the background and quite barren with no water in it, we love to continue to keep our culture strong. So we ask people to put a rock on that so they feel that they're connected to country. But also we've seen climate change happen. We've been through ice ages, and part of those stories, those cultural stories that I just briefly touched upon about the creation of country, it always stems back to water, and it always stems back to a vast period of time. So we understand and we'd love to have a little bit more say in regards to water up in our part of the country. So there's a wonderful picture of a sunset over the top of Narrow Lake. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for your beautiful presentation and for sharing beautiful country with us as well. It's just a stunning picture we have there.
The only thing that I could add to that is there are opportunities and challenges, and time is one of them. We've only just started, and we want to make sure that there are, we can depict different parts of the seasons, and the cultural calendar is the type of reaction that our group, or action that our group wants to do. Policy informing, and we want to merge some of the Western and cultural science and the ownership of water. I think there needs to be a broader conversation with people that manage water above Narrow Lakes. We don't have any control of water that has been taken out of the system above us in Queensland. And yeah, I suppose COVID-19's always been a bugger.
Thanks, Jason. We're really excited to see what happens next. It's a wonderful project you have there, and so much good coming from it. You've given a really fascinating explanation as well of the cultural and natural landscapes and how the two work together, and particularly through the indicator species of lignum. And it's also a great challenge that you've put forward as well. And we're, it's really great that you're approaching it through partnerships and using the pathways methodology. I'll just remind participants to please put any questions in the Slido app, and we'll move on to the next part of the session. We've rearranged our schedule slightly, but now we're going to go back to two speakers that you've heard from before. So Scott will go next and speak to us about limits on adaptation, because it's so far we've been talking about case studies and identifying good practice, but let's also recognise that adaptation can only go so far. So after Scott will speak, we'll hand back to Sonia, who so beautifully opened our session today. Go ahead, Scott.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Next slide, thanks. Thank you very much. Yes, as Sarah said, I'd like to talk about limitations and challenges of climate change adaptation in water resource management. Next slide, please, Lucia. And again, I'll draw on the Ipcc reports. Thanks. And just a quick overview of what I'll present is, first of all, I want to touch on what Sarah just mentioned, the fundamental limitation of climate change adaptation. And then I want to outline a series of challenges for adaptation in water resource management. And the first set of challenges are associated with dealing with uncertainty. So, for example, uncertainty in what actually is going to happen in the future, and that arises from, for example, some uncertainty in projections of rainfall, for example, especially at the local level. And there may also, or there often is, uncertainty in what the implications of those projections are for particular systems. And I'll use the Gondwana rainforest as an example of that. And just, we went through this before. So in human systems, adaptation is defined as the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects in order to moderate harm or take advantage of beneficial opportunities. Next slide, please. Next slide, thanks. And as we saw before, that mitigation in climate science refers specifically to actions or activities that limit emissions of greenhouse gases from entering the atmosphere and or reduce their levels in the atmosphere. Thanks a lot. Next slide. So let's now talk about a fundamental limitation of climate change adaptation. And briefly, it's this. Next slide, please. Briefly, it's this. If the warming is too great and the associated changes are too great, then a particular system, natural system, or a system you might happen to be managing, the changes might be so great that adaptation ceases to be effective. And it's a bit like, it then becomes a bit like shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic. And one, well, sad, disturbing example of that is the Great Barrier Reef, because the Ipcc report concludes that the majority of warmer water coral reefs, the Great Barrier Reef is an example, that exist today will largely disappear when global warming exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius. So it is very much like the deck chairs on the Titanic, if the warming exceeds or goes much above 1.5 degrees Celsius. And a similar situation arises, for example, with inundation in some low-lying atolls. So if sea level rise and inundation is too great, too frequent, too intense, then no amount of adaptation may be able to, or feasible adaptation may be able to secure water or enable the quality of the water to be sufficient for the community. So if emissions are too high, some systems go beyond their ability to cope. So let's now look at some of the uncertainties. Next slide, please. So the first couple of uncertainties I want to talk about are associated with what's going to happen in the future. And the biggest uncertainty we face is that we don't know how well the world is going to respond to the Paris Agreement, how effective it will be. So there's a whole range of possibilities for the magnitude of future changes, including this one, the magnitude of globally average surface temperature change. So there are some scenarios we consider that may give rise to 5 degrees warming. Some may hopefully give rise to much, much less, or much less than 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees Celsius, or even less. There are another source of uncertainty is that one climate model might give you a slightly different answer, a different projection for the same increase in greenhouse gases, and that's represented here by some of the shading. Next slide, please. And this highlights some of the uncertainty associated with future precipitation. So if we just look at the orangey, rusty boxes down the bottom, that shows the projected change in Victoria precipitation from a large number of climate models. And the box and whiskers represents the range that is found in those models. So you see that for the vast majority of models, around 90%, the Victoria dries out over coming decades in response to greenhouse gas increases. And however, there are some models in particular decades where the rainfall doesn't decline. And there are two reasons for that. First, because some models behave somewhat differently to the vast majority of models. And secondly, in any given decade, we might end up, by chance, getting a large number of La Niñas, for example, and not many El Niños. And so that will tend to increase in Australia rainfall and tend to offset some of or all of the anthropogenic decline in rainfall. So there's another source of uncertainty that needs to be faced that does represent a challenge. Thanks a lot. Next one. Next slide, please. So, and the other uncertainty, as I mentioned, is the uncertainty in what these projected changes mean in physical quantities, mean for the system that you're trying to manage. So here's one system, the Gondwana rainforest of Australia, and recent research showed that in addition to rainfall, and a really important source of moisture for the rainforest were the actual moisture coming directly from passing clouds that actually physically touched the rainforest and from fog. And so if you want to understand what the implications are of climate change are for these rainforests, you can't just restrict your attention to what's going to happen to rainfall. You also need to worry about what's going to happen to clouds, how high they'll be, and what's going to happen to fog. And another important point that comes out of looking at these rainforests is that in the past, we didn't really need to worry about bushfires in this part of the world. But now, with higher temperatures and lower humidity, bushfire has now become a real and serious risk. So there are two implications from looking at these rainforests. First is that we can't necessarily use the past as a guide to the future, even the near future. And second, understanding risks created by or exacerbated by climate change is not always straightforward. Sometimes it needs further research to clarify. Next slide, please. And the last point I wanted to make is the importance of thinking holistically when we're talking about climate change adaptation. Next slide, please. So the one example I want to talk about is imagine you've heard that in your part of the world that rainfall is projected to decline. So you think, okay, well, I've always been thinking about getting a pump. I'm going to install a pump and that's going to increase my water security. Problem solved. But then on the other hand, hang on a minute, if that pump runs off diesel fuel, then it's going to be generating greenhouse gases and you're going to be making the global problem worse. So yes, you've addressed adaptation, but at the expense of mitigation. So in this particular instance, a better solution might be, for example, to install solar panels with battery to run the pump. So we started to think about adaptation only, but then we changed our plans after considering broader implications, and in this case, mitigation. And so we modified our plans after thinking more broadly. Yeah, next slide, thanks. Next slide, please. Thank you. And similarly, we might be primarily focused on mitigation, helping the world reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. And so we might be thinking about, well, maybe I should reforest in a particular region. Problem solved, or is it? Well, what happens if that particular region, there are drier conditions projected, and maybe more frequent and intense bushfires are projected? So that forest, if you were to plant it, and the associated carbon might be at risk. And so you might start to stop and think, oh, hang on, is this the best solution? Maybe I should be thinking about, if you're an agricultural company, you might be thinking about another location perhaps, or maybe you start to think about firefighting strategy or some other option, but at least you've stopped and paused to think, hang on, thinking more broadly, is this the best solution to achieve the objectives? So we started to think about mitigation only, but we realized we also need to consider the impacts of climate change on our proposed mitigation solution. Next slide, please. So, we just then talked about the benefits of thinking about mitigation as well as adaptation at the same time. And when we think about mitigation, thinking about the physical impacts of climate change on any proposed mitigation strategy. But we could say similar sorts of things about a whole range of things. So, for example, if you came up with an adaptation strategy that wasn't going to assist biodiversity or make, even reduce biodiversity, then that wouldn't be a very sensible solution. Similarly, you might come up with a great adaptation solution, and maybe it's affordable to install it, but maybe it's not affordable to maintain it. Or maybe you've got some possible option for adaptation and it makes inequality worse. Or maybe you've got some solution, you haven't sat down and thought about, well, hang on a minute, in light of what, say, Lloyd was saying before and others, what happens if there's some traditional knowledge available for that region and you haven't factored that into the thinking, and you've come along with some other potential solution? Well, that solution might not get adopted. Or if it does get adopted, it might not be sustainably adopted. And so thinking about these broader issues, thinking holistically, is the reason why the Ipcc report has mentioned climate resilient development. And that's what we'll, and the challenge is, of course, that, yes, we should be trying to do this, but it can be a lot easier said than done. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that, as I mentioned, climate resilient development is the process of implementing greenhouse gas mitigation and adaptation together in support of sustainable development for all. So that's a pretty powerful statement from the Ipcc, which covers a lot of what I've just said. So you're simultaneously thinking about mitigation and adaptation, which supports sustainable development, and then the last bit, for all. You're not leaving people out. It's inclusive. You're not making inequality worse. And climate resilient development places adaptation and mitigation into a broader, more holistic context, as I've been saying. And the other conclusion of the report is that embedding effective and equitable adaptation and mitigation in development planning can reduce vulnerability, conserve and restore ecosystems, and enable climate resilient development. Next slide, please. So in summary, remember we were looking at the Great Barrier Reef and some low-lying atolls. There are critical limits to the effectiveness of climate change adaptation if warming and the associated changes are too great. So this highlights that we should never take our eye off the ball when it comes to climate change mitigation. And we also then saw the importance of climate resilient development when we think more broadly. But we noted some of the challenges associated with uncertainty about what the future might look like. Another challenge was that our experience may not be sufficient for us to properly plan for the future because we're going to see things we haven't seen before. And then we also saw a major challenge of clarifying what is the best course of action, in terms of adaptation in a more holistic sense, And that can be challenging because because of the uncertainties, and B, because we don't necessarily, because of the complexity of determining effective, sustainable solutions in some contexts. Next slide, please. So some of the key messages, I think, for water resource managers from the Ipcc report are, first of all, adaptation is vitally important, but we should never forget the fundamental importance of reducing net greenhouse gas emissions. And yes, there are many challenges in adaptation, but we cannot afford to be deterred. Too much relies on overcoming those challenges. And the third key message, I think, is we need more water resource managers to work with communities and others to help them overcome some of the challenges that I've just described. And some of the questions that people are already asking, and probably more people need to ask, is, well, what does climate change mean for the system I manage? And what next steps might I take to achieve greater resilience? Next slide, please. So again, I'd just like you to leave you with this message that the world needs water resource managers to become thoroughly engaged in these issues. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Scott. Another reminder there that we need to approach planning and thinking about resilient development in an integrated manner. There's a lot of complexity to consider there. Now I'll hand over to our final speaker, who is Sonia Cooper, who opened our session so beautifully, and we'll give her the final words to wrap up. Sonia is going to be speaking to us today about the value and importance of understanding and integrating traditional knowledge into future water adaptation planning. Thanks, Sonia. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. First of all, we have a powerhouse indeed online today, and these powerhouses operate from traditional people as well. Lloyd demonstrated that, Jason demonstrated that, and both Scott and Jimbin demonstrated how they can assist. Recognising our traditional knowledge and traditional knowledge systems may be challenging for some, but let us lead the way. We must acknowledge that Indigenous peoples' traditional countries around the world have undergone extreme changes due to colonisation, displacement and dispossession. I can tell you that it's not a thing of the past. It has never stopped, not here in Australia, but is a factors continue to be impacted. Extreme changes to our traditional countries is an epidemic in some instances. When you look at these extreme changes and climatic changes occurring, and the prediction of climatic change is harming and places further risk of traditional knowledge being impacted. Is there a cultural shift though? Is the baseline shifting in recognising that traditional knowledge may be the way of the future? Absolutely, it is. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming, even today online, and other case studies that I've heard from everywhere, including my country, that our traditional countries are changing. If we can go to the third slide, that would be great, for the National Indigenous Dialogue. Jason and Lloyd demonstrated clearly that traditional knowledge is the key, and highlighting the importance that traditional knowledge can play is crucial to our future. Is it challenging? Absolutely. It's not only a fight to be recognised as a distinct cultural nation with jurisdiction, and we've got ways of doing that are at risk, but we got to protect and maintain traditional knowledge. And this is an inherent cultural right and practice, as Jason mentioned. I'm just checking that you all can hear me.
Yeah, you're loud and clear, Sonia.
Oh, good.
Go ahead.
So in terms of the global, so with my slide, could you go to the third slide of my PowerPoint? I've got up there about the National Indigenous Dialogue.
I'm really sorry, I don't think we have it. We'll try and sort it out on our end, but please
go
ahead,
no worries.
Sonia.
No worries. The global definition provided by the World Intellectual Property on what is traditional knowledge is knowledge, know-how, skills, and practices that are developed, sustained, and passed on from generation to generation within a community, often forming part of its cultural or spiritual identity. Now, Lloyd provided a definition of traditional knowledge on weather and climate, that is ancestral knowledge, and it's about reading country for climate And this is absolutely crucial to keeping all traditional knowledge systems intact. And if country is changing, then our cultural indicators change, as Lloyd mentioned, and also Jason mentioned that, and are at further risk of climate impacts. Lloyd was very clear on that point about how his country is changing. Jason has demonstrated how his country is changing. With Yorta Yorta country, there are many changes because we also have river regulation within our country, just like many other traditional owners. And that is becoming more of a problem because the trees are suffering and the soil. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. But traditional custodians have their own traditional knowledge and their own traditional methods in how they deal with climate on country. And these case studies speak for themselves. And that is why the National Indigenous Dialogue on Climate Change, which started way back in 2012, here in Echuca, that's exactly where the Echuca Declaration came out of, that they are using right now. And these case studies, like we said, speak for themselves. It's about integrating traditional knowledge. And this is the key. If we could just go to the next slide. Thank you. It's the to the 2000, sorry, the third slide would be good, just for the definition of the National Indigenous Dialogue and what we hope to achieve from the dialogues. The gatherings are important. If we can go back to the first image of our country is changing, that would be great. So the image that you see here is from my country. It's the second one. Yep, that's it. So the image that you see here is from my country, Yorta Yorta country. This is within Barmah National Park. In the distance, you see the trees. They're marked with the watermark in the distance. So that's the shade that you can see in the levels. So this is sometimes how they run the water for long periods of time. But the other problem is that the water, when the water is there the longest, that's when the trees are starting to fall down. Our trees are collapsing. Our soil can no longer sustain its roots. We're having black water events and they're more prevalent. We just recently had a black water event in January this year. One thing that I've noticed is about 2 years ago, I decided to move back. I decided to move to country. So I live within this forest that you're looking at, these pictures today. And every day a tree collapses. And I can tell you that our soils are in trouble. Can you go to the next slide, please? And yes, I did mention about the National Indigenous Dialogue. One of the highlights from this is the importance of the ongoing dialogue. And it's made very clear from First Peoples that they're seeing these types of impacts on country. If you can go to the next slide. Yep, the next one after that, please. So when talking about last year's National Indigenous Dialogue, traditional owners got together. They said, when country is healthy, we are healthy. Our knowledge systems are interconnected with our environment, and it relies on the health of country. This knowledge is held by our elders and passed on to the next generation. I don't have to tell you what has been said. There is a statement out there that was developed in 2018 by traditional owners, and this statement was developed up in Cairns. I encourage you to get online and read the statement and to learn what traditional owners are saying here in Australia. Next slide, please. The gathering is calling, and this is just only a few items that I've taken from the statement: an annual First Nations-led dialogue on climate change, an Indigenous-led climate action hub, an Indigenous-led mitigation and adaptation climate change projects, Indigenous-led nature-based solutions, Indigenous-led adaptation planning for communities, and the recording and transmission of knowledges and experiences across the country, and Indigenous-led fight against climate change. And it's the right to manage country. This is one of the biggest fights that we have within country, and our knowledge must be included in climate management frameworks. Next slide, please. So this is a photo that I've taken from country. This on the banks here and all within those trees is where I live as well. Our soils, this is the cracking clays. We have cracking clays in Yorta Yorta country. So if you don't put an overbank flow, or the rainfall or the moisture isn't good for the soil, then we have a problem. Our soils and our clays are our cultural indicators of change as well. I don't think enough people talk about soil and talk about what that means to us. Higher temperatures and lower rainfall will impact the cracking clays further. And by doing that, climate change is definitely existing within Yorta Yorta country in that respect. Trees can no longer sustain their position. They fall. The tree fell is actually at an exponential rate. The trees crack like the clays, and it is a product of its environment. That's what's occurring in my country. Cracking clays need water and moisture. And if we have got river regulation that is extracting and taking water, then we simply can't water country. Next slide, please. So really traditional owners, there's some that are more advanced than others here in Australia. I'm working on case studies, working on, with Western scientists about what changes are occurring on their country and how they can address it. In terms of the dialogue, I mean, it's the beginning phase. We have to be mindful that stage 1 takes as long as it takes for each traditional owner group. And if you can be respectful of that time, that would be great, because if you rush, it won't be successful. You've got to give traditional owners time to gather their consensus, to understand what climate science is, to see if they can make the linking and integration with Western science and traditional knowledge happen. And if so, it actually means that you have to be sensitive to these things as well. Next slide, please. And I did say there, these national Indigenous dialogue is about leaving no one behind. Not all traditional owners are recognised by law here in Australia. Not all traditional owners have a voice, and this is the importance of the National Indigenous Climate Change dialogue. We are seeing changes in the environment. The voices are the same. The voices were the same when I was young. The voices were the same long before I was born. And the declining health of country and people. This is last year's statement. This sounds like the same statement my old people were talking about. We can see our native flora and fauna are suffering, and the conditions of our lands, waters and seas and skies declining. One of the things about water regulation is people think water is doing a good thing. Yes, it is. But if it's got heavy metals in it, if it's got chromium, if it's got zinc, if it's got lead, if it's got arsenic, if it's got high levels of aluminium, how do you think aquatic species are faring? How do you think human? How do you think for water, for consumption? Our wetlands are being watered, with heavy metals. I mean, how is that good for the cracking clays? How is that good for the biodiversity within all country? For some of our people, it is an emergency. That was definitely an absolute agreement that was coming out of the dialogue. Our connection to country presents climate science developed over countless generations. Listen to us, they say. Work with us, they say, and together we can enact a change that will shape our future for all Australians. Next slide, please. So the take-home message here is that we are seeing changes in the environment and the declining health of country and people. So when we think about how we're going to mitigate against climate change, how we're going to adapt, be mindful that when we adapt, sometimes it's forced adaptation. So we have to adapt as a people, and in turn, our traditional species are adapting before our very eyes. I just wanted to encourage people to hang in there, to really communicate, really make engagement genuine. That was one of the big things that came out of the 2011 biennial assessment about water. It's about the connections that you have, the linking that you have, and be mindful that definitions can cause harm. So redefine, explain yourselves, and be very clear when you come to traditional owners about what it is that how you want to define climate change, because sometimes it's not one in the same language, but it's about finding that balance and interlinking everything. So yeah, that's it for me today, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Such powerful words that you shared with us there. And thank you again for your generosity and time in sharing that with us. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Catherine Cross, who's AWP's Strategy and Partnerships Lead, and she'll moderate the Q&A session. So if all of our speakers could put their cameras on, that'd be great. And shout out to those of you who've put comments and questions in the Slido already. Please go ahead and ask lots more, because we've got a bit of time to explore some of these very many issues that we heard from today. So go ahead, Catherine.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to all the amazing presentations and the knowledge shared today. So perhaps to begin with, because we only have about 10 minutes for questions, we'd like to hear from maybe Jason, Lloyd, and Sonia about an example of how traditional knowledge when it comes to predicting a water-related forecast or disaster. Perhaps Lloyd, you could start just giving an example, and maybe Sonia and Jason, if you have something to add.
Regarding improve the perception of TK indicators, I guess there need to be more work in the promoting the TK indicators, because while the elders in the communities have this information, they are now passing on. We tend to have limited indicators information at community level. So through the project, when we were promoting this traditional knowledge in terms of forecast, they started to see the value in it, and of course now they want to see that they can use this information, the traditional knowledge on climate and weather that they have to pursue further. But in that regard, I guess from the partnership that Solomon Islands have with the World Vision and also the Bureau of Meteorology, that has advanced the capacity. That is one thing that is very lacking, that we are not able to reach the last mile, especially with traditional knowledge.
Great, thank you, Lloyd. Maybe I'll just invite Jason. Do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, look, it's quite an interesting concept, because we're through the early stages of understanding not only reconnecting the country, but reconnecting to those cultural indicators like the wind, some of the way that the seasons change, and certainly the trees that flower. There's a whole suite of cultural indicators, particularly the night sky. You know, all this star stories that we have connect to the changes in season, to, you know, when we hunt, why we hunt, and those indicators are plethora through the landscape. Narran Lake is its other name is called Drought, and Drought means meeting place. So once the water comes, the birds come, we send the message chicks out to all the mob to come in. We facilitate large cultural gatherings there, and we want to put ourselves back in that position too. So yeah, science, cultural science is there. It's just a matter of weaving it into how broadly water policy, and certainly some of those water managers, and more so how we want to inform that process going forward.
Great, thank you for that, and it just shows how it can precipitate action. Sonia, just invite you if you have anything to add to this question on cultural indicators and how they're used in disaster management.
Yeah, I think Lloyd and Jason have covered off on that, and I reiterate what they've said, that there are definitely extreme changes coming, and if we don't see those species in the landscape, if we don't see how the animals behave, then we can't really tell what's happening.
Great, thank you for that. So we're moving on to another question. There was a reflection of different organizations and people that need to be involved when we're having a holistic approach to addressing climate change. So this question, maybe start with Janbin. What partners are key for successful implementation of what you were presenting on in terms of multifunctional infrastructure?
Thanks, Catherine. I think that depends on the type of project we're dealing with. But in the Queensland case, we are mostly working with the City Construction Investment Development Company. They are responsible to develop the open space in the city. So no matter what type of project, we do need a lead delivery agency or implementation agency to take this on. And the way to make this happen is really to create a vision right at the beginning. And that vision is well articulated and with the benefit demonstrated by a rigorous benefit cost analysis, so that you will take other stakeholders on board and convince them this is a good way going forward. I think that's become the key to make these things happen. And then after that, we need a multidisciplinary team, from planners to architects to engineers, ecologists, that we're all working together to enable the maximum functionality of the project. Catherine.
Can I just add to that? You know, like the Murray-Darling Basin, where I live in, just spent over $13 billion, and a 14th of that was provided to Aboriginal people. What Sonia said is clear, that Aboriginal people want an opportunity to sit at the table as an equal and not have icon sites or water management processes that are occurring right now in our country that we're not being involved in. And so I think that dialogue needs to change, and hopefully the work that we continue to do with the Yorta Yorta will change those perspectives.
Great, thank you for that. It's an important message to disseminate and make sure that that it's understood from early in these processes. Perhaps just moving to Scott. So building on what you were talking about in your presentation around predictions for climate change, water scarcity and continued population growth, is there modeling around how water scarcity affects population growth that you know of?
No, I don't know about that sort of modelling. I mean, the Ipcc report makes it very clear that climate change is going to increase for example, water scarcity. So we know, for example, that extreme water storage drought is projected to increase from 3% to 8% under one scenario, so almost triple. But the Ipcc, all the bits I've read, and there's thousands of pages, but all the pages I've read, the population is taken as an input rather than an output. So you say, okay, with this population increase, with these changes in technology and greenhouse gas emissions, this is what the impacts are on that population, rather than the other way around. So no, so sorry, I don't know about looking at water scarcity as an input affecting population, but maybe someone else on the call does. Thanks.
Great, Scott, thank you for that. I know that's something to look into in more detail. So we just have a couple more minutes before we move to the wrap up. So maybe I'll invite each of the speakers just to give their advice on what would you suggest to raise awareness and increase understanding of either holistic approaches or the cultural calendar, as Jason mentioned, and traditional knowledge more broadly. How can that be taken on board and more effectively used and integrated? So what's your advice in terms of next steps? Perhaps we'll start with Sonia.
Sure. See, one of the problems is what is in theory and what people talk about and what they write about is not one that is happening on country. You know, they realize very quickly, scientists, everybody realizes very quickly that might look different on country. So when you have to actually be on country, you have to work with the traditional owners, you have to work with us to understand how we think, why we think that way, and why we're implementing what we're saying. Because this is really key to setting the relationship and also building the trust. I think that may take time. I can tell you it might not take a month. It may take 2 years. It could take 5 years. You have to work with us consistently in order to understand all of our different knowledge systems within country. Be mindful that sometimes we don't want to share that, and then that becomes a problem in itself. But yeah, that's for me is just, taking time with traditional owners. A lot of people come in and they've got timeframes and they want to get in quick and get out quick with the projects. That's disrespectful. It's just not the way it works on country.
Thanks, Sonia. And yeah, good point about needing to take time. So I'll invite Lloyd next. Can you answer the question on what do you think is some advice to increase understanding and awareness of traditional knowledge and thinking more holistically?
Yeah, thank you. I do agree with Sonia. Like in Solomon Islands, we have a lot of traditional knowledge at community level that is unexplored. And I guess working with partners in engaging with communities would be the way forward, because there's no other ways that we can, work with communities. As I have highlighted, World Vision is an NGO organization that had experiences working with communities. Unlike the Med Services, we thought the forecast that we deliver, the communities understands them, but that is not. So, getting down to the community level, provide them with the understanding, and also integrating with the traditional knowledge they have, that they understand more about the information, early warning, that they can make appropriate decisions. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. It's important to reflect communities of where the impact is happening. So that needs to sit throughout. I'll ask Jen Bin next. Very quickly, what is your advice on increasing awareness?
Yeah, I echo to what Sonia and Lloyd just talked about. I think understanding the problem is fundamental to providing a solution to it. And one of the best ways to understand the problem is to work and engage with the Indigenous group and really understand traditionally how that evolved, how the problem come about. I think that's the key message I want to say. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And then Scott, same question to you about raising awareness.
Sorry, what raising awareness of?
Raising awareness to integrate traditional knowledge and thinking more holistically. What advice would you give?
Well, maybe I'll just do the holistic part. I think the one really useful thing to do is to think about, who are the beneficiaries? Who are we trying to assist? And then with a laser-like focus on that, and then with that in mind throughout, before the project's design and during the project and after, then that plays a leading influential role on pretty much all of the decisions that get made. So, for example, if those people happen to have some relevant traditional knowledge, then if you want something to be adopted and sustainably adopted, you need to, if they're willing to provide it, you need to know what that traditional local knowledge is, because otherwise they just might not be interested in what you've got to say. So, there's an example where you've the traditional knowledge part, and then the other part is, well, if you want a solution to be sustained, then you need to try and bring in everybody who's relevant to the solution, to potential solutions. Otherwise, there might be some section of the community or someone else that's not included in the solution, and that they might actually not adopt it, or it might not benefit them. So so like I said, I think the single most important tip I would give is be very, very clear on who are the beneficiaries, and don't be so worried about, oh, I've got this fantastic new thing and I'd really love people to use it. Really need to refocus your attention on how can we help these people.
Great. Thank you for that. I think that reflects on what Sonia was saying earlier, that recognizing not everyone has a voice, and looking for ways to bring these voices and amplify them. Finally, to Jason, again, the same question: what advice would you give to raise awareness and increase understanding of traditional knowledge?
Those partnerships I talked about earlier are really pivotal to what we do out at Narran. Also, our open days, it's wonderful to have community out there, and we emphasise a lot of our work, not only just on park, but as a part of the participation methodology that we have, or just being culturally sensitive and being out there doing the work. Most of the science that goes on in and around Narran, whether it's veg, food webs, fish, and birds, we're integrated into those science platforms. So 10% of any projects that occur on our park, they have to come through us, and we change the questions that are being asked. So we not only put climate adaptation processes in it, but we also put our cultural spin that we want embedded into that. So it informs policy and the way that water is managed across country. Also, another big push that we do with because a lot of our members that are on there work in schools. We actively try and get school groups to come out to country on our open days, and it was really wonderful when I was out on country and we tell the story of how Miami had speared the great crocodile or the rainbow serpent in other cultures, but we call the crocodile Gadia, and created the lake, and this is the place where you meet now with your mob. The kids there, they were non-Indigenous kids in year 11 from the Lightning Ridge School, and they told the story. You know, I asked as we went around the circle, it was one of those spine-tingling moments. So the country that we love and we understand, and we know, they are starting to love, understand, and know. So that is a wonderful process that we put in place. Through the department I work with now, we are jointly working with information from our communications and our engagement teams to put information out there. Our language is super important in amongst explaining what country is, and there is enormous amounts of words around water and that connectivity. So we make sure that we have made sure from the Commonwealth Environmental Water Office perspective is that we got the integration of our cultural language embedded into some of our information that we send out broadly, not only to stakeholders like the education groups, but more so irrigators, you know, policy makers and shire councils, you name them. You know, like we make sure that fishing groups, we make sure that everybody knows about what we're doing up on country.
Great, thank you for that, Jason. And the key point that you mentioned is about sharing stories, and really that is the intent of this dialogue series moving forwards. So on that note, I'll just hand over to my colleague Lucia Gamara, who's the Senior Impact and Partnerships Officer at the Australian Water Partnership.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And I think this has been a great session. And everyone sharing their own examples of how they think the situation should be approached. Someone asked in the questions, what is the intent of this series? And if there will be more discussion. The next part of the series, we'll have a more interactive discussion, a reduced group as well. So what we have seen today is that we all have the same shared climate change challenges, as well as population growth, but that changes depending on where we are. And people in local places, they are the most they're best suited to answer to the questions of what is their vision, what is it that they want to achieve in the place that they are, and what are the risks that they have observed throughout the years. Especially Indigenous peoples in Australia have thousands of years of looking after country. So what we're intending with this series is to demonstrate that there are people working on that. There are challenges, but there are also opportunities. So we want to contribute to show to the world and share those experiences. I've put up a survey in the screen. If you could take 30 seconds or so to answer that survey, that would be great. It will help us tailor the next events that we host. So you can do that by joining at slido.com or by clicking the link in the chat that perhaps my colleague Zoe can copy paste. Something else that we will share today is the Zoom registration link to join the next dialogue. This will happen on the 21st of September in the same schedule from 10 to 12. So when we say that we will make it more interactive, this will be a very reduced group, maybe 25 to 30 people. The intent is for it to be a dialogue. So we will be presenting more case studies that deepen in examples of Indigenous knowledge being integrated in climate resilient water management, together with Western science, of course. We have one person responding, very thank you very much for whoever responded that. We are running out of time, so I might just move on to the next questions. And as Sarah mentioned at the beginning, if you have any more questions or comments, do send them through us to contact@waterpartnership.org.au. Or if you're already in contact with us and know our emails, just shoot through your questions. Also, if you have any comments about the Slido app, that would be great to know. You can see that in the top right corner, this is 0 next to the icon of people, which means that at this moment, yes, thank you. There aren't many people responding to questions. But yes, what we want is to share these type of stories and experiences. As Sonia mentioned, this is only the beginning, and in the beginning phase, we have to put more effort, put more time, have that willingness to work together and to listen. Yes, we won't get very far unless we listen to what local people, Indigenous peoples have to say and what they want for their own country, and the risks that they have experienced, as well as the solutions that are culturally appropriate to them, and the values and benefits that they wish to obtain. We have a couple more questions coming up. Thank you very much to the people responding the survey. I'll just copy paste the link. Oh, you can respond to that comment, Jason, if you wish. Yes, our friends from Asia Water Council are here. Thank you very much for coming. So I'm copy pasting the link to register to the next session. As I mentioned, it will be a 2-hour session, a dialogue with case studies and a broader discussion. Hopefully we'll keep the case studies to 1 hour and the discussion to 1 hour as well. So we are running over time, apologies for that. But thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. We will be sharing the slides as well as the recording, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.